Hello painters, welcome to the demo. I'm going to show you how to stretch a canvas, very straightforward, and then maybe we'll gesso it. Alright, let's talk a little bit about different kinds of stretcher bars that you may have bought. These thick ones are called heavy-duty stretcher bars. They are about 1.5 inches in width. You may find these bars by Fredericks, which are pretty common on the market. And these, you will notice, have a lip that's equal on each side. So they're really meant to be used either way. There's no front or back to the equal lip at the edge. Now remember, the canvas is going to come over here and wrap around like so. Now the third kind of stretcher bar this is a medium, light or medium duty, and you'll notice that there's a lip on just one side and the other side is flat on the edge. So I personally, up to about 2 feet in each dimension, I like the medium ones. These are made by Jack Richardson Company, and the heavy duty ones, all kinds of companies make them, and they're pretty. They also usually have a directional lip. You can see that on this side is the lip. So now that we've looked at the different stretcher bars, let's go ahead and look at some of the tools you're going to need real quick. You're going to need a staple gun. This is a heavy-duty staple gun. I don't recommend it. I left my light-duty staple gun at school during the pandemic and haven't stretched canvas since then because I've been working on paper. But this is called the heavy-duty one. The light-duty, you're going to get staples that say light-duty staples, and usually they should say Aero brand JT21. For heavy-duty, make sure you get the right staples for your staple gun. These are T50, which is the heavy-duty staples. You see there, it says T50, Aero brand. So make sure you have the right one. So I have some heavy-duty staples in here. If you get the wrong staples for the staple gun, if you get light-duty for a heavy-duty gun, or vice versa, it's not going to work. You're going to be confused, and you're going to open the staples so you can't return them to the store. So that's no good. So make sure you have the right staples. I like to have a pair of pliers because inevitably a few staples go awry. So it's good to yank those out with a pair of pliers. You can use a screwdriver or something, but it's just easier to hold the staple and yank it. And you should have some measuring implement, measuring tape, a yardstick, whatever. And it's usually a good idea to have some kind of metal thing, a screwdriver, something that has a little bit of a sturdy, not too sharp, like this one you can see it's a bit dull. Something to pull out staples if they go in the wrong way. Now, we want to start by putting together the stretcher. So I'm going to make sure I have 2 pairs of bars. These are all a mishmash, so let me see if I can find the right ones. And I will, look at that. I got lucky. So I got 2 pairs that are the same size. So let me clear out a little room by moving the other ones I'm not using. All right, go. And these over here. Okay. All right, very good. So you can see I've got pair and pair, and you can see that there's a hole on the one side, but not on the other. So I'm going to put the hole side with the non-hole side, and I like to do the 2 sides for 2 corners first. Now this was not ideal. You can see here that this is chipped. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see that the edge of that, let me see if you can get a good angle. The edge of that stretcher bar is a little bit chipped right there. So it's not going to be perfect, but for these purposes of demonstration, it'll do fine. Ordinarily, were I using this, I would probably discard this one. Or if you're really careful, you could actually take a little wood filler and fill it in. All right, so we're gonna tighten these up. Now, I like to use either a wooden piece of a stick or the wooden part of a hammer. It's a little tight, it's been humid the last few days, so that will affect the wood width. Reassemble the stretcher. Oops, and these have pre-cut tongue and groove that should fit nicely in there. You may have to tap it. I wouldn't tap it with the metal part of the hammer. I use wood because it's easy to do. Now you want to make sure you have a right angle. So there's a lot of ways to do that. One, you may have, or someone in your house may have, some kind of carpenter's right angle tool. So this is called an L, what's it called? I don't know what it's called, I forgot what it's called. But, and this is a little bit of right angle. So you can see that when I put it here, it's way off 90 degrees. So I need to tweak it a little bit, not a big surprise. And I can actually tweak it to that. Now, if you're in a building that you know is built well, sometimes people use door frames and jam it up against a door frame to test it. I live in an old house, and a lot of people, a lot of carpenters aren't that great, so I don't trust it 100%. But we have this 90 degrees, looks pretty good. So, if it's a bigger stretcher, you have to, a bigger carpenter's L square is not a bad idea to get. This is obviously fine for small things, but once you get beyond a foot or so, it's not going to cover you that much. And the other problem that you encounter with stretchers is that the wood can often warp, so you want to make sure when you buy the stretcher in the store, you're getting the right size. All right, so I've got my canvas here. Now I need to cut it, so I'm going to go get the scissors from over here, right over here for a knife. Okay, so you can use scissors, you can use a utility knife, you can use an X-Acto, whatever. I'm just going to notch the canvas. Now I'm going to give myself, I have to think about the fact that the canvas, you're going to want a little overhang. You don't want too much. You want just enough that I like to have it so it sort of ends up halfway across the stretcher bar. So that, I push it tight to see, and I straighten it out. Now I can measure that. I like to measure it with my fingers, but you can also measure it with your proper ruler. This is about 1 3/4 inches. So what I can do is I can actually measure 1 3/4 inches here and notch it right there. And you don't have to cut the whole way across. You probably know that already. You can just tear the canvas. It's along the weft or the weave. I don't know if it's the weft or the woof. These textile terms. Okay, so we've got our canvas. Sometimes it's a little weird. Got the thing, and it may be a little long on the sides, but actually it's pretty good. And you can see that when I tighten it, it goes a little short of the edge, which is nice. Now, if you have a small canvas, sometimes you end up with a scrap, or you want to make sure you don't want to throw out a piece of canvas and your stretcher bar is a little long. You can actually, do it to the side. It's just if you're not going to frame the painting, most contemporary paintings usually don't get framed, unless you want to do some kind of cloth tape around the edges or some tape around the edges. You're going to see that. It's going to look a little sloppy, but that is how old-fashioned, when linen was very expensive and canvas was super expensive. Usually old master paintings, European paintings and old American paintings, they tend to just stretch them to the edge. And they would use little copper tacks that I will show you. All right, so here I have a little baggie of old-fashioned, and sometimes you can get them, they're called furniture tacks. Some art stores that sell sort of old-fashioned painting supplies often sell them. And these are, usually they have a copper coating, so that if they oxidize, they don't go nuts with the rust, and they stop with the first coat of green oxidation, and they are little copper or brass tacks, and this would have been, and they're very short. You can see that each one is really very small, and you would have hammered those in. Now you can do that, you can use those for sure. It's a little bit of a hassle, but it's doable. Well, let's use the staples because we're in 2020, although we are making an anachronistic art form. So the first thing I want to do is I want to line it up, and I'm going to just, actually I'm going to take a staple to the long side. I'm going to make sure both sides are about even. I'm going to take a staple to the long side in the middle. Now, I'm using heavy duty staples. They're a little longer than I need. The only problem with that is that if I ever want to unstretch the canvas, it's a pain in the neck. But if I use light duty, it's easier. But if I'm not going to unstretch it, if I'm going to give it as a gift to grandma, it's going to be fine. So I'm going to stretch it now. I take the other side, I stretch it a little bit here, I pull it taut, and you can actually see that there's a little bit of a crease where I've stretched it. That crease is okay for the first side. I take the other side. Now I've got 1 and 1 opposite each other, so the canvas is held in place. I'm going to take either one of the short sides, I'm going to fold it over, pop it in, other side, stretch it. Now this fourth one is the key. You got to stretch it pretty tight. And it's not going to be like a drum yet because we only have the four staples, but it should be getting there. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to do a staple. You can go clockwise or counterclockwise. I try to stay consistent, and you're going to do a staple on the outside of each of those 4. So you've got the 4 cardinal directions. You come out, you expand it. I'm doing these a little bit close just for the demo. So make sure you tighten it each time. This is a little hard if you're not used to it. Your fingers may not be used to these weird muscles. You'll be using weird muscles. If you do it a lot, your fingers will get a little less sore. The other thing that's annoying about the heavy-duty staple gun is it requires a lot of hand strength. It's really more for contractor work. So, but it'll be fine. So I do. You see, I've got the first one and then my 2 outside ones. First one and 2 outside ones. I go around and I keep doing that. And I sometimes pull a little bit on the other side too to make sure I'm not getting creases. And it's pretty easy to stretch a small canvas this size. A bigger canvas, and particularly linen, which is a stiffer fabric, which tends to crease, is a lot harder. As you approach the corners, you're gonna have to think a little bit about which way to approach first. And what I would suggest is choose a corner. Whoops, that one popped out. Sometimes the staples pop out like that, no big deal. Fix it. I like to choose a side and keep going that way. So I'll go, oops, let me pause it because we got new staples needed. Choose a side and you're gonna go in that direction, and then when you get that stapled, you're gonna fold it, you're gonna tuck and fold over to get a nice corner, hospital bed corner. So I'll show you what that looks like. First we staple all the way. I've got it stapled on one side, but it's floating around in the other. So I fold and I tuck, and I like to align as much as possible the fold, the tuck fold, along the edge. So I can pull this tight and give it a couple of staples here, here at the edge, and that corner looks pretty nice. And this is, you can hear it's a little tighter now. So I'll go ahead and do the other corners the same way. So I went this way and then here, so I'm gonna follow and go counterclockwise. And again, it doesn't really matter. Probably won't make a huge difference if you do corner to corner, but some people I've seen do symmetrical corners, so they'll do both folded in on the same side and the same at the bottom. Technically that's I mean, it's not great. I guess it's usually fine, but it means that the tension isn't distributed evenly. The tension is going to be more pronounced in one direction than another. So I like to have it be alternating corners for me. So we go quickly, we do all the corners. And again, I'm following the sequence. I nip and tuck like a plastic surgeon. flesh young. Of course, in the old days, they would have just had paintings to do, make themselves look good in their paintings. Okay, so now I can finish, and here it is. There's the stretcher, and you can see there it is. Now, notice that I used the canvas. Let me see if I can show you this. I used the canvas. I didn't, now notice there's a lip on this side. I didn't wrap it. You want to wrap it so that the lip is towards the surface of the canvas. So if I unstretch this, what I mean by that, and by the way, this is just to show you how easy it is to unstretch it. If I unstretch the corner here, it's going to mess up the tension a little bit. So if I were doing this for real, I'd have to unstretch it evenly. But this is just a demo. So you can also pull the staples out, usually if it's sturdy canvas. So notice that the lip side is on the surface of the canvas, not on the back. So that's a classic beginner's mistake, is to have the lip on the back of the canvas, not the front. So I can re-stretch this and have it. Now that that's clear. And if you're using those Frederick stretchers that have a small lip that's the same on both sides, then like this, see the lip is the same on both sides, here and here. It doesn't really matter which way you use it. So that's the canvas. Now, once you have that done, you're going to want to gesso it so that it has, this is the raw canvas look, and this is with primer. Now there's different primers, different surfaces you can use. This one happens to be what I use for my work, which is, first I use a size, which seals the canvas. It's a glue. And this is I use a very traditional concoction of rabbit skin glue, made out of little mammal skin, as the name implies. And you have to warm it up in a double boiler. It's a whole process. And then I apply oil primer, which is essentially a specially formulated titanium white, to do the surface. But you're going to use acrylic gesso, which is pretty straightforward. And it comes in big tubs. You can get it smaller too. This is an old tub I have. So let's take a look at the gesso and get that started, and I'll show you how to gesso the canvas. Now, a few things I'm gonna want. I'm gonna want a rag. Your rag is gonna get trashed, so use old socks or t-shirts that you are throwing away. I collect old t-shirts I find on the street here in Brooklyn. People are always throwing away clothes, so I find old scrappy t-shirts that people are put on their fences to give away. I wash them and then I cut them up for rags. Okay, so you're gonna want the rag. You can apply gesso with either a brush, or I like to apply it with a scraper. So you can use a metal scraper, works pretty well, and make sure it has rounded edges so you don't get lines in your gesso. I also particularly like the plastic spreader. You can get these at Lowe's for about $1.50, or any hardware store, most hardware stores. They're used actually for paint trimming, but also to spread things. And you can also use an inexpensive 3-inch brush. Let me go find one so I can show you what that looks like. Okay, you can use, these are called chip brushes, which with two P's, like chocolate chips with two P's, because it's the chip company usually makes them, although there's plenty of companies that make cheap brushes. They're usually hog's hair, and you can get, this is a 1.5 inch. I recommend, this is a 3-inch, is a pretty good size for that. I personally like to apply the gesso, as I said, with a knife or a spatula. And you can experiment. Some people like the brush, some people I like the spatula because it gives me a very flat surface, and I use less gesso per coat, and it's smoother. So I find it less wasteful and it's smoother. So I've opened the tub. The gesso's a little bit old, and oh, that's the door. So I just want to mention that it's useful when you're doing this stuff to have clean jars, plastic tubs. So I keep a lot of recycling. I wash extra well, and I keep it for uses like this. So I'm gonna get a little plastic tub. I've got some water here, so I'll put it in the tub so you can see it. Here's my water. So you can see what I'm doing. And here I have a delicious ice cream jar. I have it with a lid so I can save the gesso that I'm going to water down for another use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of gesso. Now I don't need much because the canvas that I stretched is pretty small. And this is pretty watery gesso. I'm going to give it a little bit of a stir because it's separated. I haven't used it in a few months. It's probably a good idea, just like any paint, liquid paint, to give it a stir so all the solids that have settled to the bottom get brought up. Pretty obvious. Now, this is pretty watery. You can see that it's sticking, it's not dripping, but it's not super thick. I'm going to water it down just a little bit for the first coat. I find that actually watering it down helps a little bit get it into the weave of the canvas. So I'm going to take just a little bit. I don't need too much, maybe another spoonful. So I've got, I don't know, about 2 or 3 tablespoons. And again, you're going to have to get a feel for how much you need each time, depending on the size of the canvas. So I've got my little ice cream jar. I'm going to put in a few drops of water. I'm going to thin it out. I overdid it. That's all right. And I would say for the first coat, it's fine for it to be pretty thin. I'm mixing it with this knife, palette knife. It's not the best mixing method. I just don't want to have to deal with cleaning a brush after this. But if you're using a brush, it's easier to mix it more evenly with a brush. Now, because I have a sealable jar, I'm going to do something very clever. And by the way, gesso dries pretty quickly. So if you have tools and you don't want to have to clean them extra later, I suggest just give them a wipe. And I actually keep, now you might not get these. I saved a bunch of old phone books when they were still making them, and I use it to clean brushes and palette knives as I'm working. Because the gesso will dry quickly, especially a thin layer. So if you have your tools covered in gesso, keep them clean. It's not too hard to clean a metal knife, but it's harder to clean a brush and a plastic thing. So I'm giving it a good mixeroo, and I've got pretty liquid. Now it's pourable. So if this were a bigger container and I was mixing more gesso, mixed up. Now I'm going to pour it out, because why not? Giving it a shake helped, but you can scoop it out with the trimmer. Now this one, if you use an edge trimmer, you notice I've used this a lot, so it's got a little bit of a curve in it, in the blade. When they're new, they're flat, but they do have one side that's convex and one side that's concave. So you want to use the side that's sort of convex, that has the outside of the C, as it were, the letter C. So I'm just going to pour a little bit of gesso. Actually, I'll do it with the metal one. It's a little easier to scoop out. And this is pretty watery, which I like, and I like a really smooth surface to work on. It means I use less paint, I waste less paint. So I gesso, I push it right out to the surface, of the edge of the surface, because it's pretty wet. Even though it's a kind of a warm day, it's about 79 degrees in here. Nice day, low humidity. Now I've got it, and I can do the edges as well. That is up to you. It's probably a good idea if you want the painting to last a long time, for hundreds of years, because a lot of times the paint, as we all know, drips off the edge. So actually I find that the surface is pretty fast and the edges take longer. This is the one downside of the knife method, is the edges. So I actually modify it, maybe for all that I didn't want to wash the brush. I'm going to use my brush. I'm going to take some off from here because I've got a lot. And I'm going to just brush it on the edges because it's a lot easier. And the other nice thing about the brush, I will admit, for especially the first coat, where the grain, depending on how grainy your canvas is, it'll get right in there into the grain of the canvas and really fill up the holes. Because what you want to do is essentially create a kind of blocking surface that blocks the oil or the acrylic from getting absorbed into the canvas. Now, I've got my painted brush. Remember what I said, this gesso will dry quickly, so I'm going to stick it immediately in some water. I'm gonna just clean this up. I'm gonna have a little extra. When you scrape, especially with this method, I'm gonna clean my table so I don't get gesso all over the back. That's why it's good to have a rag. I like rags. Paper towels are okay, but they tend to break in the studio. Now it's okay if this first layer has a little bit of the canvas showing through at the peaks of its tooth, of its nub. I like to just eliminate as much of, now watch out when you push that you don't push through your fingers, you don't want them coming through and leaving. When it's wet, it's okay, it's pretty flexible. Once it dries, it'll be a little bit more susceptible to cracking. Few artists, when they scrape it like this, they like to push the gesso all the way out and get almost like a buttery icing edge. That's fine. You can do that, or you can smooth it out with your finger or with the brush, but I already stuck the brush in the water, in which case I have to dry it out, which is a pain. So I'm just gonna wipe it out. And this is actually where this thing is nice, because this has a nice wide thing, so I can actually come through and do one final layer. Remember, clean this quickly. I'm gonna seal the gesso so it doesn't dry. I'm gonna wipe my knife so I don't have, it's much easier. I mean, you can clean it later, scrape the stuff off, but gesso's pretty sticky, pretty hard, so it's easier to do it when it's wet. Even if it's a little bit dry, and it's only been dry for a few minutes, it hasn't fully cured yet, so it comes off pretty easily, but it's a lot more of a scraping job in an hour or so when it really sets. So the gesso is still wet. Now, I always end up getting little eyelashes or hairs from my arms. I have hairy arms, so I get the hairs out, and that, I actually have a pair of tweezers I keep for that, but you can also just do it with a nice sharp palette knife. It drives me crazy to find little hairs of mine in my paintings. So I'm going to put this up on the little tub so that it dries and there's a less chance of a hair blowing onto it. And when I'm going to let it dry for an hour or two, give it a second coat. I'm going to sand it between coats once it's dry with a fine grit sandpaper, 200 grit or higher. 200 to 300 is ideal. You could probably be okay with 150, but I would stick to 200 to 300. This is 320, very, very fine grit. And you can even go up to 400 or 500. And you just give it a light sanding on the coat, between coats. The final layer, very light sanding. And you can actually use canvas scraps or linen scraps that you have from the edge of the canvas that you tore up for the final coat, and give it a buffing with this so that it's smooth, but it doesn't sand the gesso surface off down back to the canvas. And then you'll be done, and you'll have a nice, smooth surface. I'll show you the last 2 or 3 layers. All right, we're back. The canvas is dry, so it's ready for a quick sanding, very light sanding. You'll notice it gets smoother very quickly. And I still have my ice cream tub of gesso. So the nice thing is when you have the tub, something sealable, yogurt container, whatever, it makes it very fast to do each layer. So you can actually do a few canvases at a time. And I don't really have to worry about the edges that much, because I already did them. I tend not to worry too much about the second and third coat on the edges. I hit this and it's really just a few minutes, really only a couple minutes. If it's even a bigger canvas, you'll find the spreader goes a lot faster than the brush. So just like I did last time, I spread it with the metal. I take the plastic to give it a final coat. And you can futz it a bit. And I can put this left over, and it's good to go. It'll need a few more coats though, not that good to go. It'll need, I would say, if you're using this thin gesso, 4 or 5 coats. And again, you're doing this at home, presumably, your studio. So, you know, this is something to do while you're hanging out, just in between tasks. And you can leave your brushes in water if you don't want to deal with it till the very end. And when you're really done, soap it off so the gesso comes off, and you're all good.